The title of this session is a bit of a follow-up from the earlier one, Regulating Behind Closed Doors. But just be aware that I tend to go off script. So if we could just keep this conversation between us and not let Lorraine and Marion know that I've kind of not followed the script, that'd be great, because it's just between us, really kind of quiet. So I'd like to really have a conversation about two things. Firstly, regulating behind closed doors in the sense of what have we learned from the experience of COVID that we can take forward? How do we regulate behind closed borders, closed lockdowns, things like that? And then a bit of a conversation that came up from the chat before. To save time, I just saved some questions from the earlier session to, I call that efficiency, other people call it perhaps avoiding doing my work. So, but I'll start with this. Given that we've got such experienced people who've thought deeply about this, I wanted to start with this question. There's two questions really. What are the kind of regulatory incidents that you've looked at over your careers that have really bothered you in the past, and what have we learned from those? So I'll start with you, Val.
Without question, robo-debt. And what was so disturbing about that was not so much that the algorithm was wrong in the first place, but there wasn't the structures in place to actually hear the voices of those who knew there were a problem. And I mean, the staff did know, the frontline staff knew, but they just couldn't get the voices heard. So it's interesting in that case that the regulators themselves, frontline regulators themselves, can be silenced, but that would be my pick. And the law, I mean, it was a good lesson for me too, because I'm not a lawyer. I appreciate law, but as you would have known, probably know, I work at the other end, the persuasion, education, that sort of end. So it's a really good lesson to me that the law really matters, because it was law that actually brought that to a halt.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question if I can take over from you, Jarrod, and that was Val told me she might say something like that, and I said to her, but that Royal Commission did a great job on making transparent what were the failings of the public servants, of the politicians, right up to the level of the Prime Minister. But I just haven't seen who wrote such a incompetent algorithm. That I'm presuming.
The person up there in the back row.
Yeah, must be
Sorry, I don't mean that.
Must be someone in the room. I wonder if someone here knows that or has a reflection on, what it was about that process. I mean, going forward, where we are going to have more algorithmic regulation, that's an important issue, to hold whatever consultants wrote such an extraordinarily incompetent algorithm accountable as well. There's this principle that it is desirable in regulatory work to hold everyone accountable who should be accountable, who was accountable. That doesn't mean they're responsible under criminal law or even regulatory law, but the regulator has to hold itself accountable when it didn't watch the ball as adequately as it should have. That's a puzzle, isn't it? Is that a puzzle, or do you all know who wrote the robo-debt algorithm? Is someone going to jump up and say it was one of the big four accounting firms or something? You know?
I don't know, but I can understand how it happens.
Yeah.
Because you have people that are analytic, they analyse and they come up with beautiful graphs that they then give to people above them without actually fact-checking that. That challenge of analysing stuff and having enough understanding of what you're analysing when it comes up with something. And I think they forgot to do that check. So they didn't
You know, Jarrod?
I don't know who. This has really gone off script much sooner than I thought. You can ask me questions, that's fine. I did want to come to this issue of algorithms later on in the conversation, but let's go there now. One of the biggest challenges that's facing us as regulators is how to use algorithms. but also how to regulate algorithms. There are so many parts of our society that are controlled by algorithms that it's almost too important to just leave it to the free market. So, you look at the power of Facebook, Google, TikTok, all of these things that feed into our society. How do we as regulators actually get the skills and understanding of what is going on inside those black boxes? Because I think with the robo-debt issue is you've got this algorithm. Who knew how that worked? Like, who was the person who knew how that worked? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a challenge that we are going to be faced with for the next 10 or 20 years. And I don't know that we've really done much thinking about how you would go about regulating that part of our community. Not really a question, so anyway.
I mean, my thought about what's going to happen in the long run is that, the biggest worry about, there are lots of worries about algorithmic regulation and some opportunities as well. But the biggest worries are about algorithm in armed conflicts. So, therefore, it's going to be the defence people who are going to be talking most about international agreements to control AI for killer robots and drones and so on. They're not doing a great job of it at the moment, but the imperative will become clear as soon as people start to think about, well, what happens in a world where 1 million killer robots can be created quite cheaply to go into a country and kill every member of the ruling party, go to the buildings that are like Parliament buildings that are inhabited by the ruling party and kill every member, and if there's resistance, then the algorithm says kill everyone who is in uniform or who is carrying a gun, so all the bus ticket collectors and concierges wearing uniforms in hotels will be killed by, unless there's some regulation of that and the weapons, the algorithmic warfare manufacturers are going to lose money unless they come to the table to come up with some. And then I would have hoped that the regulators would learn a lot from their ideas for how they'll reach international agreements to put guardrails around algorithms in warfighting. It's all but pretty worrying. And robo-debt were such crude errors. We have to worry about more sophisticated errors in future.
And it is. This speaks to this issue of one area learning about regulation from another, and how in the past it's been so bad, and that's why this conference is so good. But child protection very early on used a kind of a rudimentary algorithm, which was children who were abused or neglected were more likely to be found in families where single parents, without a job, poverty was a problem, mental illness was an issue. So there were a whole lot of predictors, and these things do actually predict families that are involved in child protection really well. But, in using that kind of thinking, and actually algorithms were used in the US, you are immediately abusing human rights, because very often, for those of you who don't know, it's about targeting. It is about targeting those families, but the supports that we give to those families, even in Australia, there's been research to show that we just don't give the right supports. So we often do more harm than good, so they're targeted, and then we make things so much worse through our interventions. So that warning, a colleague of mine at university, I think it was in the 80s, was doing that kind of work. So we've known about the dangers of that for such a long time, but that knowledge has not jumped. There has been a sort of a silo. And it's sort of interesting, isn't it, how some ideas take off so well, they just sort of go around the world, and then the wisdom of the damage that they can do doesn't seem to spread. It's blocked amongst those on the ground who really see the consequences. So I think those mechanisms need to be strengthened. We need to be learning. We need to have some better structures. Conferences are great, but something better to ensure that learning takes place so that the learnings of defence in this case, and I'm sure this is going to... Well, it's already happened, hasn't it? I mean, civilians are being killed by drones, this is not uncommon at the moment. So having that sort of knowledge transferred to other areas of government and regulation, do we need better mechanisms for that?
And I mean, for the moment, there's a real case for being a conservative, a Burkean conservative about stick with the things you understand until you really understand. If you're putting guardrails around an AI that in some ways is 1,000 times smarter than you, maybe in limited ways, but still, they might also be a lot smarter at gaming those guardrails than you think they are. So it's very challenging, I think.
So I think I'll try and get back on script. So
I think
as
you've been
best I can.
reprimanded.
So I think the question I've got is, so we've had a bit of a chat about some of the biggest things that have concerned you and some of the challenges. And I guess my next question is, well, what have been the biggest improvements? Like, what are the things that we should celebrate that we can learn from that have actually achieved positive outcomes?
Let John go first on this one.
All right, well, I'll be sneaky and I'll tell the story that I was going to tell and answer the first question, but use it to answer the second. I didn't used to tell... It's a very old story. I didn't used to tell this story out of respect for... it's a story about where the head of a regulatory agency in Australia ended their term earlier than they might otherwise have done because of this, and another member of the... I think two members of the agency were dismissed over the incident. And it's quite a bit more than 40 years ago now. I was a member of the old part-time commissioner, an associate commissioner of the Trade Practices Commission for 10 years. And this incident happened in the mid-80s. The behaviour started in the mid-80s. The Tobacco Institute was running advertisements all over the country, full-page advertisements in the Women's Weekly, the Metropolitan Daily newspapers, all the high-impact media outlets of that time, arguing that there was a lot of false science being put out that passive smoking is bad for your health. There is no evidence that passive smoking is harmful to people. That was the advertisement. A complaint came into the Trade Practices Commission from Action on Smoking and Health was the lead complainant, but they were with support of many other NGOs with health concerns around the country, saying that advertisement was misleading under the terms of Part 5 of the Trade Practices Act, and that the Commission should take enforcement action against the Tobacco Institute and get those advertisements out of our media. As it happened, the chair of the ACCC, or Trade Practices Commission became the ACCC. The Trade Practices Commission at that time came from the tobacco industry. He was the director of the largest tobacco company in the country and also became chair of that largest company. He negotiated a what was called a remedial advertisement at that time, where a new advertisement would be placed that said certain claims in our old advertisement should have said wrong, but said actually not quite right, but blah, 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 blah. But it still effectively said that there's no evidence that's really clear that passive smoking is bad for your health, so that unnecessary panic is being created in the community on this issue. The deal was done behind closed doors, even, one might say, in a smoke-filled room. And the remedial advertisement was very unsatisfactory. But I went to see the chair and said I thought it was most inappropriate that you negotiated this remedial advertisement behind closed doors. I have substantive concerns about the content of the remedial advertisement, but the order has been issued. That's done. What I would like us to learn from is the procedure. That procedurally, especially in the circumstances where there were criticisms from health groups and so on, someone with a tobacco industry background coming into this important regulatory position, you should have been super cautious. And normally in a case like this, we would have multiple commissioners involved in the deliberation, and in particular, I should have personally would have wanted to have been in the deliberation of this, given the background being a very different one from yours, which was the reason why I was appointed after you were appointed, as partly a response to that outrage. So that's what happened then. Then a week later, on the front page of the media, there was a story, internal division in Trade Practices Commission over Tobacco Institute advertisements. So I was called in to see the chairman and asked, was I responsible for this in the light of our earlier conversation on the matter? And I said, no, I wasn't. It was a total surprise to me, but obviously there are other people in the Commission who had the same concern that I did. Well, and I genuinely knew nothing about this. I had not spoken to any journalists, and I had no idea who it was who had said this to the journalist. That person was subsequently discovered and dismissed, with sad consequences for their career. It's a story, though, about how transparency is a complex business. So if the internal contestation, I'm not saying that those of us who contested it internally in those different ways chose the best way to do it, because it was very divisive for the agency. But the internal contest for transparency, we didn't know what was going on between you and the tobacco industry in the chairman's office that day, and we're not satisfied substantively with the result. Well, what happened was Action on Smoking and Health then lodged a complaint that went to the federal court against the Trade Practices Commission for approving the second ad, which it alleged was a breach of the Act, and also alleging that the Tobacco Institute had for a second time breached the Trade Practices Act with misleading claims to the effect that there was no evidence. And indeed, Justice Morling at the Federal Court found that the Trade Practices Commission hadn't approved a remedial ad, which was a breach of its own Act, and found, and it was a very significant finding of a major court around the world. It was the first court around the world that reached the conclusion that the evidence is indeed now clear that passive smoking is dangerous for health. What happened then was there was a lot of social movement activism led by Action on Smoking and Health worldwide. So within about a year, not only right across Australia, but right across much of the world, there were no buildings where people were being allowed to come to work or visit the mall, or even in an open-air sporting ground, most surprisingly at all, with very high levels of compliance of the sporting club saying you're not allowed to smoke in the grandstands. anymore. This even happened in the United States. A lot of interesting regulatory writing on how surprising it is that, American baseball fans complied, and there was not a major problem of resistance to smoking in grandstand. But the most important part of that was, of course, the insurance companies and the reinsurers saying, well, if you're allowing smoking inside of this building, given this pretty authoritative Australian decision, which is now being picked up by other courts around the world, well, we're not going to insure you. We're not going to cover you if people sue your organisation because they get lung cancer and you're allowing smoking in the workplace. So I won't labour the messages for that because it's a bit of a long story. But I think if you think about it, there are many dimensions of that story behind closed door. Now, the second question, it was also, that incident was also a foundation for, it was the ACCC that led the work on the formulation of enforceable undertakings. So today that remedial advertisement would be part of an enforceable undertaking. It would be on the ACCC website, the details of it. There would be a process of, a hearing with opportunities for contesting the content of the enforceable undertaking. So it's been proceduralised within the ACCC as a regulatory agency. It's been proceduralised in terms of the accessibilities, like the website display of the details of the agreement and when different things will be done by on the website and can be contested by the public before it leads to a contest in the federal court.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I think that's an interesting. One of the questions we were talking about earlier was, the conversations behind closed doors between regulators and regulatees. That's kind of an old school style of regulation. Bank of England used to call people in and have a conversation over a cup of tea and the behaviour would change. So, without using all those tools. So I think the observation that enforceable undertakings is a way of making those sorts of conversations visible and transparent is a useful tool. But I am interested in exploring whether or not there is still a place for those conversations between regulators and duty holders, particularly where you may not have a clear tool. So you often will see a harm, you don't have a real tool, but you need to take action. What sort of advice would you give to regulators in those sort of circumstances? I might start with you, Val.
I'm going to pass that one to John because I think you need experience at seeing that. And I can't think of an experience just at this moment. So have you got one that you can think of?
Well, I totally agree with that sentiment. That's a story about a formal complaint made by an NGO that the Act has been breached and the regulator agreeing with that view. So the Commission agreed that the first advertisement was a breach of the Act and therefore that remedial action at considerable expense to the company to put all these further ads in the Women's Weekly and the Sydney Morning Herald and so on were required. So that doesn't make for an argument against having cups of tea and sorting something out when things are, to put it in terms that I like, much lower in the pyramid. That was already pretty high in the pyramid. That story, that was so high that it became an international issue, changing a whole lot of things at great cost to a lot of organisations. Even a lot of things should be dealt with by regulators short of a cup of tea. So, to take a real example, lids off barrels of chemicals, oil, that sort of stuff in an automotive workshop, little organisation, and the inspector says, look, you got the lid off that. Those chemicals should not. What happens if someone backs a forklift truck into that barrel and spills it all over the floor, and that there are fumes come off this? You know what are you doing? It's not the most dangerous chemical on earth, but you know that's just sloppy practice. And the smart automotive guy, and some of those guys really are so street smart, say, oh yeah, of course we always have the lid on those barrels. The only reason the lid is off that barrel at the moment is that you, the inspector, came to the door, and we've been told that when they come to the door we've got to drop everything and the first priority is to respond to you. So that's a situation where, he's got a pretty good story to take into any formal enforcement action you want to take. So you just want to get it fixed, and you can even pick up that lid and put it on yourself and get it fixed. Like, fix it now. The risk is gone. I've given you a shot over the bows. Quite enough, cost-effective regulatory response. You can even have a joke of it. Oh, you say you're the only reason you get the lid off was you so love responding to having the inspector knocked on your door, but thousands wouldn't believe you, and perhaps thousands of courts wouldn't believe you, but I believe you, of course. But let's hope that doesn't happen again. That's fine. And for a lot of problems, I obviously think a restorative justice conference is a good idea, and the ACCC did a lot of what were early innovations in restorative justice to come up with solutions to the problem sitting in the circle. Yeah.
I guess it's about how far you've progressed with the problem, and you may not have enough evidence, you may not want to go to court, but you may feel that you could flag that you could invest in a further investigation and you could actually pursue it. Then a quiet conversation, I think, can work quite well, because let me give an example. Not that I've seen this should have happened and it didn't work, but with the universities and sexual harassment and abuse in universities, which has built up into a huge issue. TEXA did a lot of work on trying to get people up to speed on what they could do. In fact, John and I went to talk to them about using restorative justice in this kind of context, and nothing really happened. I mean, they had the brochure approach and setting up a wellbeing unit if you cared to go there, or you could always go to the police. That was sort of crudely how it played out. It would have been wise, and then the universities had their organisation, so the group of 8, and that they had their representatives to push their position, and they were all going to stay together. That was pretty clear. In that situation, it may have been quite effective for TEXA to go and look the Vice-Chancellors in the eye and foreshadow what they were going to do if they didn't see real movement on that front. I don't think they did, because the person in TEXA who really had poured her heart and soul into trying to get movement actually left the organisation. I tried to contact her recently and she's no longer there. So that's a situation. Affirmative action was the other situation I thought of, where Valerie Pratt spent all of her time sitting in the offices of CEOs and senior human resource people to try to explain. It was this business of explaining the benefits, ensuring them of the fairness and reasonableness and of their moral obligation. And that can often be done very effectively, especially if you then have the capacity to go up the pyramid, as we say. So, but yes, yeah, go on.
What you suggested for the university is kind of what did happen with the militaries and the generals when they were looked in the eye, they did blink, and they responded much more constructively than the University Vice-Chancellors did, much more constructively than the Catholic Church did, and actually had thousands of restorative justice processes and a lot of compensation, and the Defence Department has an ongoing restorative resolutions unit that members of the Defence Force can go to over bullying matters as well.
I think just reflecting on the presentation yesterday from Adele Ferguson, one of the comments that came up through that was around, this failure of corporate governance and failure of ethics at some of these big organisations. How do we as regulators, what tools do you have to change such fundamental things that are existing in these sort of institutions? I can't put a licence condition on someone to say behave ethically. What are the tools that we do, noting that culture change takes time?
That's where I think the community is so important, this investment, that the community understands what you're doing and what you're trying to do, and reflecting their priorities. When Malcolm was talking about picking a problem, the problem has to be one that resonates with the community. And so you can confidently say, unless we fix this problem, the community is going to be absolutely outraged. And the politicians really are going to come in and tighten up legislation or do some such thing. Usually people think politicians make things worse, so that's probably a threat in itself. But that's why, I think regulators are a little nervous about their moral, ethical purpose at the moment, and are very... what does our legislation enable us to do? We'll only do what our legislation says. But when you think in that way, and I understand why, but when you think in that way, you actually can lose sight of your moral purpose, and that moral purpose is what the community cares about. The community doesn't care about all those little bits of the legislation. That's your tool to serve the community. That would be how I see that.
Again, I did kind of like General Hurley's approach to cultural transformation in the military. He's now the Governor-General, of course, and his approach was unique in that he required his head of Army, head of Navy, head of Air Force to sit in some, undoubtedly only a couple in each case, but he required the whole most senior 40 or 50 officers of the Defence Force to sit in some restorative conferences listening to the stories of the victims of those 2000 sexual assault complaint, being actively hands-on in those couple of cases, in being responsible as the most senior defence member in that particular conference, to issue the apology on behalf of the Defence Force that what had been happened to them had been allowed to happen, to negotiate with them on an offer of a compensation settlement, in some cases to agree with the outcome of the conference that this was a matter that could only be properly dealt with by referring to the Director of Public Prosecutions for a criminal prosecution, for saying on other cases this person will be referred to our disciplinary committee now with a recommendation from this restorative conference of consideration of this person being thrown out of the Australian Defence Force, and quite a considerable number of them were. But I'm not trying to focus on the question, which is how do you achieve cultural transformation? Getting all the people who matter most in the organisation involved in the process of listening, healing, repairing, responding, and saying, well, what I'm promising to you, survivor of this sexual assault, is that we are going to have a transformative change in this organisation on this issue, and there are going to be consequences for a lot of people, and I'm going to be part of ensuring, and I have the backing of my Chief of Defence, General Hurley, in that matter. I think that was. I'm sure there'll be someone who could jump up and say, "Well, this and that terrible thing still happened." But I think there was some transformative change personally.
I'm going to open it up for audience questions. I don't know if anyone's put any through on here, but if I can't make it work, just put your hand up and we'll see how we go.
I feel like people might be bored of seeing this question because I've put it up a few times and it hasn't been answered. From the ACT EPA, I mean, Environmental Protection Authorities around Australia and New Zealand, there's a current move to getting results of testing and environmental management plans proactively published online. We get a lot of FOIs in the ACT EPA to get those same results. And what I'm wondering is whether in other regulatory spaces there's evidence that proactive publication of releases and results increases decreases the likelihood of catastrophic outcomes, and whether, like, what evidence there might be for the public. In the environment space, data tends to be risky because it can look very scary to the uninformed. I don't know why the mic's working so bad.
I don't know of evidence, but I am someone who advocates transparency as much as possible for two reasons. That if you're transparent, people might get very angry with you, but they'll have a conversation with you. They won't turn their backs on you. And it's having the public turn their back on you that leaves you as a regulator out in the cold without any support. So I always think that the resistance that occurs often when you publish data and people get scared, it actually makes you talk. Now, politicians don't necessarily agree with that, I know, but it's always good to have those conversations because you're informing your public. The downside of that, if I was to argue against myself, is that there are people out there who do, take every opportunity to find information that they can use in a very destructive way against the regulatory agency. It's not that they want to make things better, they want to destroy the agency or they want to destroy someone in it. That's the downside of it. But my general feeling is that we need a far more transparency. Citizen scientists are really interesting to me. So there's so much emphasis and so much use of citizen scientists now. Now, I don't know what the equivalent is in the regulatory world. I've been thinking about this quite a lot. How do we actually engage the public in the regulatory activities in a safe way, safe and respectful way? I'm still working on that one. But transparency as a principle is absolutely essential for that to proceed.
Yeah, I also don't really know the answer to the question, but an element of a lot of enforceable undertakings is that there will be, some sort of compliance consultant, law firm, auditor, who will be retained by the company to do an audit of whether the agreed change has actually taken place. It's also a very good practice for regulators to require those audit reports to be made public up on the website, and it's very widespread that doesn't happen, but there are some agencies that are doing that, and there is some evidence that one of the good things that can happen when that is done is that a competitor in the compliance consultancy market will, put their foot in either to the company or to the regulator and say, hey, that's a really bodgy job that my competing compliance consultants has done. This should have also been checked. That should have also been checked. It clearly hasn't. So it's a very totally unpersuasive and unsatisfactory execution of that aspect of the enforceable undertaking, with the hope that the the company's going to switch their future business to them, and that the regulator will strike down that compliance report as unsatisfactory fulfilment of the restorative undertaking. So I think there's a little bit of evidence of that bit, the transparency actually working.
It's just a quick comment, Andrew, from EPA South Australia. We make pretty much everything publicly available. And that was much to the despair of people who we regulate, and still is to some extent. But the advantages are significant. That you get rid of the whole, you're a secret society, everything's transparent, it's all available for free. You can have it, we'll overwhelm you with data, and South Australian EPA. So it's a great spot to be in. Once you rip the Band-Aid off, it's off forever, and it's a good place to be in.
Hi, I'm from the Regulatory Authority for Early Childhood Services in New South Wales, and we regulate under a national regime that I would say is quite good. My question is around the educate and inform layer of the pyramid. A lot of our efforts are directed to those working directly with children in various services, so we're talking preschools, long day care and that type of thing. But we have this tension with those that are making decisions in large organisations, so boards, management committees and so on. What's your advice around how we can persuade that group of key decision makers and stakeholders to do the right thing?
I think there are parallels with aged care there too. These big corporations, and some of them are international corporations as well. And we know from our tax work that the international organisations, the big multinationals, aren't really too scared of the tax office. So it's a tough one. And like nursing homes, if you actually close down a childcare centre, you're certainly not going to have the community on your side. And then, of course, we've got the daycare, which is, we know already it's been implicated in visa fraud and various underworld activities. So it is a tough one. John, do you have some thoughts? I mean, I would simply say some kind of enforcement activity is necessary. I'm not so sure education and persuasion might work if some of them really thought they were going to go to jail, or that they were going to be hit with really heavy fines. That's one. It's your choice. What someone said last night at dinner: follow the light of the candle, or feel the heat. I thought that was a really nice saying. Yeah, but yes, what?
Yeah, there are some follow the light of the candle or feel the heat issues with an area like that, where it's very hard to shut down a facility even when human rights are being threatened by the way the place is being run, because there's a shortage of supply in that particular region. The parents won't be happy. They would rather get more vigilant, and so that's good in a way, because you want to animate the parents of the children to become more involved as day-to-day monitors, have their opportunity to sit in the education and persuade conversations through there. But you also need to change the sanctions because of that reality. So in aged care or in childcare, these are both kinds of institutions where there are, per child subsidies from governments. So you don't want to withdraw them, because the parents will be outraged by that as well, with very good reasons. But what the kind of sanction needed is, at the peak of that pyramid, is you're not going to get any subsidy for admission of any new child until you have complied with this enforceable undertaking agreement. So let's discuss the details of the enforceable undertaking agreement with the participation of the parents, and explaining to the parents that if there's not compliance, we're not going to ruin your life by shutting the place down, but we're going to effectively prevent any other parent from putting their child in here until this is fixed. That creates great incentives to get things fixed quickly.
Can I just quickly also say, in vocational education, similar situation, but it intrigues me that we don't really know who owns the many different providers, and I should think that's probably the case in childcare. So thinking along the lines of reputational damage being a very powerful sanction as well, some mechanism for identifying not the individual childcare centre, which is not what you want to do, but the providers, because you can always tell the narrative that these childcare educators are just going above and beyond with limited resources to provide the care. But where you want to target are the names of those bigger providers. And we don't do that in aged care, we don't do that in childcare, childcare, and we don't do that in vocational education. It's quite hard to find out who they are.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time.
Sorry.
But that's been a really good conversation. We've only got a few minutes for afternoon tea, and then we're back for the plenary session. So if everyone could just join me in thanking the professors. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you for your good questions.
Yeah, thank you. It went quickly.